We start in New York City, where just a short time ago, Donald Trump's testimony went from combative to, in the words of our NBC News producer, inside the courtroom, completely out of control. The former president ranting on the witness stand, attacking the judge for finding him guilty of committing fraud, saying, quote, "The fraud is on the court, not me." It follows several hours of repeated clashes, not just between the former president and prosecutors, but between Trump and the judge, who's been trying to keep things on track. Judge Engoron has repeatedly warned Trump not to go off on tangents. He grew so frustrated, he called on Trump's attorney to control the former president, warning him this is not a political rally, and then later beseeching him to control Trump. In calmer moments, Trump has argued his assets were actually vastly undervalued by accountants. In the case of Mar-a-Lago, insisting it's as much as 100 times more valuable than the $28 million estimate. The judge has already ruled Trump and his family committed fraud. This is about what kind of penalties they might face, including whether the Trumps will be barred from ever running a company in New York again. Joining me now, Sue Craig, investigative reporter for the New York Times, who has been in the courtroom today, along with MSNBC legal analyst Lisa Rubin, who also just left court. Carol Leonnig is a national investigative reporter for the Washington Post and co-author of the book, A Very Stable Genius. She is an MSNBC contributor. So, Lisa, you literally just ran out of court. This sounds almost unlike anything I've heard coming together in a courtroom, or I should say perhaps falling apart. What happened in there?
Well, I think what happened in there is what I and others, probably including Suzanne, have largely predicted would happen, which is what happens when Trump's rants outside the courtroom suddenly migrate inside the walls of the testimony that the Attorney General is trying to elicit inside Judge Arthur Engoron's courtroom. And indeed, that has happened. So Trump, when faced with a question he does not like, one that usually calls for a yes or no answer, repeatedly digresses to talk first about the insanely high value of his assets. And then over time, it has progressively morphed into more angry rants about the judge himself, about the Attorney General, about the disclaimers in his financial statements that he calls themselves worthless. And Chris, you're right to say I'm really flabbergasted right now. I've never seen anything like this in all of my time of being a lawyer. Trump even proceeded at one point to take a piece of paper out of his pocket. It was a page from one of his statements of financial condition that talk about what his personal responsibilities were. And he asked Judge Engoron if he could read from that. I will tell you and our viewers that it is not standard. In fact, I've never seen a witness being allowed to read from a document that they themselves bring to the witness stand. That's not allowed. But when Judge Engoron said, no, you may not read that, he said, shock, and moved on. It's a very combative, very angry Donald Trump. The question is whether the Attorney General is getting what they need as a result of that.
I'm reading, if I can here, Sue, from this document. We're getting reports in real time from our folks, our NBC producers who are watching this. Trump is going off, no restraint. What did it feel like to be inside that room? Something so different, as Lisa just pointed out, than anything she's ever seen or most of us have ever even heard of.
Right. He was really angry, and that just came through almost at every question. Not only was he non-responsive, he would not answer questions, but then he would go on a speech. At one point, it felt like even when he wasn't yelling, it was like a travel guide for his various properties. He would go on about how great each one was and, you know, the views from windows. And then he would go back into just being really angry. And at one point, he even started yelling at the judge, saying, "You don't know me, you don't understand me," in essence, and how, you know, basically, how dare you do this? And then another point, Trump's lawyers were in the courtroom. They were standing up, and the judge was so angry, he just ordered them to sit down. You know, it feels just even Trump's lawyer at one point, you know, he's referring to Donald Trump, he said, as the former president, and then he said, and the future president. And as a result, his point was he should get more latitude. But that's the sort of rhetoric you're hearing. I think there's one audience here for Team Trump, and that's the larger political audience. They clearly know they've lost this case. It's already come down on summary judgment against them. They're going to be facing a fine, will likely have to pay one after this snakes its way through the appellate court. So they were just trying to be as loud as they could today to make their point about how unfair they are. And Donald Trump, you know, he's playing a role, I think, many know well, and that's the victim here today.
Is that, because you're nodding as I'm watching you, Lisa, is that it? You can see no, I guess, strategic reason for handling this the way they did, either Donald Trump himself or his lawyers, legally.
You know, Chris, I think if you're thinking about how to mount a constructive defense here, I'm not saying it's a successful one. I would refer you back to last week when we saw Eric and John Jr. Their defense was a much more cognizable one. It was, we effectively ran the company at a very high macro level. We were entitled to rely on the accountants and lawyers that we surrounded ourselves with. But that's not Donald Trump's defense at all. Donald Trump's defense seems to be, irrespective of the year of the statement of financial condition that we're talking about, the property in question was invariably worth more than was listed in the statement of financial condition. So there was no overvaluation. If there was, it wasn't material given the whole panoply of his assets. And even if there was a material overvaluation, it was an error. It was a mistake. And this judge who doesn't know him labeled him a fraud without correctly ascertaining what his intent was. So every time he goes off on one of these long tangents and the attorney general or the judge objects, Chris Kise is up at his feet saying, essentially, Your Honor, you got to let him spout off because this really goes to the heart of the case, which is about intent. That's really what we're doing here. It's not just about the remedies and the damages, but the attorney general has 6 more claims in addition to the one on which they won summary judgment. Each of those claims require proof of intent by the individual defendants and the Trump entities themselves. So they are trying to show that Donald Trump not only was involved in the valuation problems here, but that he intended for them to happen. He was directly involved in them. He approved and signed off on them. And if he didn't, that wasn't just negligent on his part. That was outright recklessness.
Yeah. Was there a moment, Sue, that you saw where you thought, this is the Donald Trump who built a reputation, who was so proud of the reputation he believed he had, that just putting the name Trump on a building made it double, triple, 100 times more valuable than the same building that didn't have the name Trump on it? The guy, frankly, who ran on it, who told the American people when he successfully ran for president, I can do for the country what I did for this business. I'm looking at one part of this readout where he says, people don't know how good a company I built because people like you, referencing the judge, are going around demeaning me, and I think it's hurting America. Was that the Donald Trump who essentially has had his whole life been able to talk his way or explain his way out of a lot of really tight places?
Right. It's interesting because, you know, you're right. He ran on president on the idea that it's kind of his sort of know-how to start a company and to build it up that America needs. And I think the idea that Donald Trump exaggerates and that he has lied about his asset value and his net worth is sort of soaked, I think, into the bloodstream of this country. But he has been doing it for so long. I think he has come to believe it. I think the reality behind that, you know, in 2020, the New York Times, my colleagues and I got a hold of 20 years of his personal and corporate tax returns. And we saw in there most of his businesses consistently lose money year in and year out. I remember there was another story we did where we got his tax returns from the 1980s, and we found in that year we were able to show he lost more money than almost any individual American taxpayer. What we found is different than what's in Donald Trump's head, and I think he believes very much a lot of what he says. He says it over and over, and I think it's become a truth to him that these assets are worth, you know, billions of dollars. And he's now on the stand today saying not only that, but that he is going to bring experts in to show that an asset like Mar-a-Lago, he mentioned that in particular, is worth more than $1 billion. There's very much a disconnect. I think, I'm not sure he believes all of it. I don't really know. I could get inside his head and examine that. But I do think that a lot of it has been a lie that he's told so often that he's come to believe some of it.